Boland is quite likely to appear on the paper this June. There are two reasons for that. First of all, she is a woman, and second, she is Irish. If you look over past papers, you will see that there is a consistent pattern of women and Irish poets coming up disproportionately. Now, of course, this doesn't mean anything, nothing's set in stone. It could well be a paper with only men on it. We don't know. But if you were to go by past papers, it's quite likely that she's going to be on. So, just a few words about the poetry question. It's worth 50 marks for the prescribed poetry. The length that we suggest here is 4 A4 pages in kind of medium writing. In my own Leaving Cert, I wrote 5 pages on T.S. Eliot, and the exam back then was a bit shorter. Um, so it really depends, I suppose, on how much you feel you can say about a poet, but 4 pages would be a decent guideline. So, with any poetry question, um, there are just two things that you always need to keep in mind. And this really applies to Shakespeare, to your single text, but the most important things are what the poet is writing about and how they're writing about it. So, what they're writing about is also called themes, it's also called subject matter. How they're writing about it is made up of things like imagery, structure, the kind of language that they use, the kind of poetic techniques that they use, and all those ways of really accentuating what they're writing about, which brings me to the third point, and that is kind of the bonus thing on top of the two things, the what and the how. And the third thing is how they're connected. So, the reason why poets write in certain ways, it's always to emphasize what they're writing about. So, for example, use of precise language helps them to communicate a certain theme. So, we're going to talk about the different themes that are involved in Boland's poems. So, first off is society. So, Boland, being an Irish woman, she's very proud to be Irish. She talks about the country quite a lot. Uh, in terms of her biography, she was the daughter of the Irish ambassador to the UK. And as you can imagine, that is a hugely important post. This was back in times when the UK Ireland relationships were especially complicated. So she spent part of her childhood in London, and that has shaped the way that she perceives Ireland and made her especially proud to be Irish. Having said all that, she's not kind of nationalist in a closed minded kind of way. She talks about the difficulties between Ireland and Britain, and she certainly doesn't hold back. She doesn't try and sugarcoat it, but at the same time, she always argues for civic responsibility, humanity, peace, trying to live together rather than kind of one nation prevailing over the other. There are a number of poems that feature this. So, The War Horse, The Famine Road, Child of Our Time, and Outside History are all important in discussing this theme. So, this is an example from The War Horse. The concept of death and the adjective casual are juxtaposed in the sentence. So, just to remind you, juxtaposition is the placement of two things beside each other to produce a contrasting effect. This draws the reader's attention to the idea that death has become casual in this setting. So, casual iron of his shoes, minting the innocent earth, that's a simile for the impact that violence has on defenseless civilians. The verb stamps describes something both irreversible and flippant. So it is easy to stamp something, but you can't take away the stamp once you've stamped it. And what she's probably alluding to here, very indirectly, is it's just like shooting a gun at someone. You can very easily pull the trigger, but it can't be undone. Um, so it's a particularly precise choice of words, just as a side note. Um, Note that the speaker seems very calm as well. There's nothing unusual about the experience. And that's probably a criticizing kind of a comment on how desensitized people tend to get as far as death is concerned when it is constantly happening around them. Now we're going to move on to the theme of children and motherhood. So the themes of children and motherhood are very dominant throughout her poetry. You can see a whole list of poems talking about motherhood and children here. So we're going to look at an example from the poem Child of Our Time. So the poem opens very dramatically. Obviously, there's something that happened between yesterday and today, such that knowing a lullaby became significant. It could have been the beginning of a tender poem about motherhood, but unfortunately, this is an incredibly poignant poem that marks the death of a child in a bombing in Dublin that occurred in 1974. So, addressing her counterpart directly allows the speaker to be more personal in this poem. The language is unusual straight away. You have taught me. So, children don't usually teach adults, so it's a sign that something unnatural, something very unusual is going on. Evidently, the impact of what happened has inspired the poet to write a poem overnight. This marks the extent to which Boland was shocked by the event. The word order is used in an unusual way as well. Perhaps this marks the clarity and urgency that's required to address this terrible event, and that again is a remark on her use of language. So, children obviously cry as a matter of course, but the term final cry inspires sort of horrible images of the child's last moments as the explosion took place. So, the language is simple, but is really moving and powerful. This is a very abstract example of the theme of motherhood. It's as much to do with society as it is to do with motherhood. And there will be other examples of motherhood that are very kind of domestic and cute, and we'll talk about that in a little while. The other thing that Boland wrote about that very few poets have written about is suburban life, and it's not usually considered to be elevated and sophisticated enough to deserve a poet's attention. However, suburban life got a mention in a number of Boland's poems here below. So, This Moment, White Hawthorn, The Pomegranate, and The War Horse, even. So, This Moment celebrates motherhood, nature, and simple joys in life. So, while the structure, the sentences, everything is very simple about this poem, there is clear anticipation and intrigue. So, Boland managed to incorporate something really exciting into an image of suburban life. So the short, impatient sentences really help to achieve that here, and that's another example of how um, imagery and structure help to emphasize the theme of the poem. The next thing we're going to talk about is Boland and how she viewed being a woman. So there's quite a lot of feminism in her poetry, and it's clearest in The Shadow Doll, Outside History, and The Famine Road. Just be a little bit careful when talking about feminism, because in the context of poetry, it's very elevated and it's very kind and gentle. It's not sort of revolutionary and maybe aggressive as we sometimes see it in our modern day context. Um, the thing about poetry that it's never hateful. It's always trying to be kind of the bigger person, if that makes sense. The poet is always trying to take a very omnipresent point of view, trying to be non-biased, non-judgmental. So when Boland talks about being a woman, it's really celebrating women and emphasizing that they deserve more attention rather than necessarily blaming anyone. So this is an example from the poem The Shadow Doll. So a shadow doll is a doll dressed in a mock-up of the wedding dress. So this would have been given to a woman by her dressmaker during the Victorian era, and a protective glass dome would rest on top. So here's the image of a protected, shielded doll, and that emphasizes the extent to which the bride's thoughts are hidden. She's discreet about her anxieties and desires. Quickenings refers to pregnancy, perhaps something that the speaker sees as her future, but the mood of the poem suggests that she's apprehensive about it. Another notable thing about Boland's subject matter is that it tends to be very personal. So a lot of her poems are quite autobiographic, most notably Love, White Hawthorn, and The Pomegranate. So here's an example from The Pomegranate. Um, so we all love this image here. It's very relatable. Few poets would ever manage to incorporate cans of Coke and Greek and Roman mythology into one poem. As well as being an image that refers to the Bible, it's also a very cute image because it talks about a situation that could have easily happened in Boland's life. She could have easily uh, passed by her child's room and seen that image. So this is a more kind of personal take on motherhood, as well as just um, being a very personal poem. At the same time, the image of whole fruit is probably referring to the Bible. So the fruit being uncut kind of implies that at some point it will be cut or bitten into, and the poet is apprehensive of what may happen then. And that is kind of feeding into the whole theme of letting go and letting your child grow up, which is also, of course, deeply personal. Boland also experimented with structure. The Famine Road, the Pomegranate, and This Moment all have rather unusual structure, and we've spoken about this moment quite a bit already. So the structure is deliberately uncomplicated, perhaps to emphasize the relative simplicity of suburban life and to make the point that complexity isn't required for someone to be happy. Mythology also feeds into the how of Boland wrote her poems. So she referred to quite a lot of Greek mythology, probably a little bit of Roman, but we can just stick with Greek if that's easier. And in Love and the Pomegranate, she compares um, her family members to characters from Greek mythology. So, this is an allusion probably to Homer's Odyssey. It's talking about Greek mythology here in the river Styx, and it is crossed as one enters hell. In Greek mythology, the equivalent of Christian hell is called the underworld. So, the image of a hellish river at dusk creates a kind of an eerie atmosphere. And obviously, the tale of Odyssey is significant in terms of how it could reflect on the poet's relationship with her husband. The language, as we've seen many times, tends to be quite plain but very deliberate. And ultimately, so the last three things we've talked about are structure, mythology, and language, and all the other things have been themes. So how do they intertwine? They really help to create believable characters. So every character tends to be quite complex. There's no one who's quite black and white. All the characters are really believable, relatable, and realistic. And there's a lot of sort of humanity and emotion described in a quite a non-judgmental way. Um, Boland has a way of communicating people's attitudes and emotions in a very clear way. So I hope that this video has helped you with your study of Boland. We have notes in a lot more detail about Boland and sample answers on the website, as well as complete guides to the exam this June, as well as the one in 2018. And you can check them out there on the website. I look forward to answering more of your questions. This video was made because you guys requested it on Twitter as the poet of your choice. So do tweet at 625points on Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat. We're everywhere. Let us know what is missing for you, and we'll try and make life easier for you for the exams. Best of luck.